everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, I'm Rachel and I'm an Egyptology PhD candidate, and this video is going to be an introduction all about ancient Egyptian religion. Now, just a quick warning before I start the video, there is going to be a bit of talk later about dead animals and animal mummies, but I will put a warning on screen just before I talk about all of that, so you can skip it if you want to. But if you want to learn all about ancient Egyptian religion, please keep watching. So, ancient Egyptian religion. I'm sure that you probably know a little bit about it already. I'm sure most people have at least seen images of Egyptian gods with all different animal heads on. But I think the most important thing to remember about the ancient Egyptian religion is that it's quite different to the religions that we know and that are common today. And you can see this in the gods that were worshipped, in the religious practices, and right down to the vocabulary that we've used. So in ancient Egyptian, there isn't actually a word that directly translates as religion. The closest thing that we have is the phrase eret het, which literally translates as doing things, and was used to refer to the rituals that were performed as part of Egyptian religion. Religion was a very important part of ancient Egyptian society, and it intertwined with many other aspects of ancient Egyptian life. So there are many cases where the boundaries between religion and other aspects of society, such as politics especially, or medicine and many others, the boundaries between these and religion are kind of blurry. You can't really see where one ends and the other begins. And we can see this from the very important role that the king, who was also the political head of state, played in Egyptian religion. From very early on in pharaonic society, living kings were associated with the god Horus, and deceased kings were associated with the god Osiris. The role of the king in Egyptian society had a very strong religious element, but also vice versa, the king was an essential part of Egyptian religion itself. And this can be seen in one of the king's titles, which is the Lord of Doing Things, Nebet Eret Het. The king was placed on earth by the gods and was actually believed to be a descendant of the gods. And his role was to rule and govern people and also to appease the gods. And his most important duty was to maintain something called Maat. Maat is a principle which is really central to Egyptian theology, but it can also be anthropomorphized as a goddess as well. And it's quite difficult to translate directly, but it kind of refers to concepts such as justice, truth, order, things like that. So essentially, in maintaining Maat, it was the king's duty to maintain balance and order on earth. The king was also theoretically, he was basically the main point of contact with the gods, and he was technically the high priest of every temple in Egypt. But obviously, in reality, this is a little bit of a logistical nightmare to be able to go around every temple in Egypt and perform the rituals. So each temple did have a high priest who was not the king. And the priests in each temple essentially acted as the king's representatives. And from reliefs in temple walls, we never have depictions of priests actually performing the roles. It was always the king depicted doing it, as he was really considered the only person worthy of doing so and of being in direct contact with the gods. Within temples, there were many different types of priests, all with very different job titles. But the priests in Egyptian temples were very different to in modern religion. In modern religions, roles of religious leaders will involve things like giving sermons or services to their congregations. But this was not a part of ancient Egyptian religion at all. Ancient Egyptian priests actually had no responsibilities towards the outside world and outside members of the same religion, and most people weren't actually allowed into the temple complex at all, although members of the public did have the opportunity to interact with the cult statue of the god from a temple during things such as festivals. The role of the priests was actually to act as the servants of the god in the god's house on earth, which is what the temple actually represented. And this is reflected in one particular reasonably common priest title, Hemnecha, which actually translates directly as servant of the god. So temples, yeah, they were the god's house on earth, and they were also given special tax status by the king, where they were at least partly, if not fully, exempt from paying taxes. And there were also tax breaks for priests as well. We know this from evidence from texts. For example, the famous Rosetta Stone actually contains text from a decree from Ptolemy V from 196 BCE, which details some of the concessions that he's made for temples and priests. Each temple or temple complex, which involved a larger collection of buildings, was dedicated to the worship of just one god, or from the New Kingdom onwards, a family triad of gods. These triads involved a family group of a father, a mother, and child. For example, at the Karnak temple complex in Thebes, the family group of gods that was worshipped was Amun, his wife Mut, and their son Montu. Within the temple was where the rituals were performed. So there was a cult statue of the god in pretty much the centre of the temple in the naos, which only priests that had been initiated into the specific rituals would have had access to. There were many statues and images of the god throughout the temple, but the cult statue would have been the one that the god inhabited for the purpose of receiving offerings, and it would have been the one that was activated by the opening of the mouth ritual. We have evidence from the New Kingdom for daily rituals that involved the opening of the naos doors, which had been bound shut after the end of the previous ritual, the purification and cleansing of the cult statue, and the clothing and anointing of the statue before leaving and sealing the doors again ready for the next time. And there's evidence of this happening about 3 or 4 times a day. There were also offerings which were given to the gods, and these were often food and drink offerings, but from later periods, mummified animals were also offered to the gods. From the late period, which began in the 7th century BCE, certain temples offered pilgrims the option to pay for a mummified animal to be offered to the temple god. These animals were bred specifically for the purpose of being turned into offerings, and some of them would have died naturally, but we do also have evidence of animals being killed specifically to fulfill the demand for these offerings. For example, CT scans of some cat mummies have actually revealed young kittens which have had their necks snapped. So obviously the temples had a greater demand for these mummified animal offerings than the supply of animals which were dying of natural causes. Once they'd been dedicated to the god, the animals were then ritually buried, and they were buried in the same sites for quite a long period of time, which we can tell from the sheer amount of mummies that have been discovered. For example, at Saqqara, there's been around 4 million ibis, mummified ibises that have been discovered. Some of these animals were also treated quite badly by earlier archaeologists. So if it wasn't bad enough that they'd been intentionally murdered to become an offering to the gods, in the 19th century there were hundreds of tons of mummified cats that were shipped from Egypt to Liverpool in England to be used as fertiliser. So to make things a little bit less morbid than that, let's go back to the gods themselves. So as I said earlier, chances are you've probably seen images of Egyptian gods with animal heads and human-shaped bodies. This was one form that the gods took, but they could also take solely animal forms. But they needed forms with some human attributes to be able to interact with humans. For example, the god Thoth could be depicted as an ibis, but he was also the god of writing, and obviously an ibis as a bird can't write, so he needed to have a form with human arms and hands to be able to do this action of writing. And so Thoth was also depicted as a human with the head of an ibis. The animals that were linked with each god were generally related to the role or the personality of the god. For example, there's the god Khepri, who's depicted as a dung beetle. Now, dung beetles roll their eggs into balls of dung, and this was related to Khepri's role of rolling the ball of the sun across the sky. Or there's the goddess Sekhmet, who is a fierce and aggressive goddess, so she's depicted as a lion. Or there's the demon deity Ammit, also known as the Devourer of Souls, who ate the hearts of the dead who had done wrong in their lifetime and was part lion, part crocodile, and part hippo, all animals that would quite happily devour you. As you can probably guess from the fact that I've been mentioning a few different Egyptian gods, the ancient Egyptian religion was polytheistic, so there was always more than one god being worshipped at one time, and there are actually a lot of ancient Egyptian gods. One of the defining features of the ancient Egyptian religion was its long-term continuity of belief. So many of the same gods were worshipped continuously for over 3,000 years. But there is one period which there was an exception to this polytheistic belief, which was the Amarna period. The religious change in this period was brought about by the pharaoh Akhenaten, who shunned the worship of most of the Egyptian pantheon in favour of worshipping the sun god Aten. And as part of the changes that he made, there were changes made to the religion, but there were also other societal changes. One of which was moving the capital city of Egypt to a completely new site in central Egypt and making a new city which was called Akhetaten, which translates as Horizon of the Aten, but is now called Amarna, hence this is the Amarna period. Within this period, the only god involved in official worship was the god Aten, and the way that this was done was also different to other periods. So the king worshipped the god Aten, but everybody else worshipped the king and also the royal family. There was also an ongoing persecution of other gods which had been worshipped for several thousand years previously. So their images were defaced. Any names of kings, which included the name of a god, such as Amenhotep, which included the name of the god Amun, these were chiselled out so you couldn't read them. The same happened with the plural word for gods, and the central concept of Maat, which I mentioned earlier, was no longer depicted as a goddess at all. However, other gods were still worshipped in private homes, particularly gods that were involved in the protection of the home and protection during childbirth, such as Bes and Taweret. But the official religion during this period was a form of monotheism. However, this didn't really last very long, and within a period of about 20 years, religion had reverted back to the worship of the original pantheon. And we can see some evidence for this in a stela from year 3 of Tutankhamun, which is known as the Restoration Stela, which discusses the restoration of the traditional Egyptian religion. And we can see that the Amarna period was viewed as rather unacceptable by later Egyptians. For example, the kings from this period were missed out on king lists, any monuments that they had were destroyed or usurped, their images were defaced, their names were chiselled out, everything that Akhenaten himself had done with mentions of the gods were now done to the rulers of the Amarna period. Egyptian religion then continued in its traditional polytheistic form until the early 1st millennium CE, when it began to decline, mostly due to the spread of Christianity in Egypt and the incompatibility of the polytheistic ancient Egyptian religion with the monotheistic Christian religion. It's obviously difficult to put a firm date on the end of the ancient Egyptian religion for when the last person ceased worshipping the ancient Egyptian gods, but this religion declined throughout the first half of the 1st millennium CE. And the last remaining ancient Egyptian temple situated at Philae was closed in 535 CE. So obviously I could probably go on for quite some time about ancient Egyptian religion. There's so many aspects to it, so much to say. But since this is just supposed to be an introduction video, I will probably stop talking now. But I will have some videos on individual Egyptian gods coming soon, so don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss them. And you can check out my introductions to other aspects of ancient Egyptian society that are already up on my channel. And if you liked this video, give it a like, and I will see you in my next one.